main characters, but only one. A man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the same Mary who massaged the Lord's feet with aromatic oils and then wiped them with her hair. It was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Master, the one you love so very much, is sick." When Jesus got the message, he said, "This sickness is not fatal. It will become an occasion to show God's glory by glorifying God's Son." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. But oddly, when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed on where he was for 2 more days. And after the 2 days, he said to his disciples who were with him, "Now let's go back to Judea." And they said, "Well, Rabbi, you can't do that. The Jews are out to kill you, and you're going back." Mary and Martha are a family group. In fact, it's hard not to imagine that this was Jesus' adult family of choice. And he spent time with them, eating and laughing and talking. They lived in Bethany, which is about 4 miles from Jerusalem. And so while Jesus was probably at home in Capernaum when he was in the Galilee, he was almost certainly making his home with Mary and Martha and Lazarus in the times he was in Jerusalem. They were an important part of his intimate support group, his family. And word is sent to Jesus in Jerusalem that Lazarus is ill, and Jesus does not rush to the scene. Instead, he seems to tarry. He seems to tarry, which is strange because right there in verse 5, we hear that Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. We don't actually hear that kind of specific information about who Jesus loves. So Jesus replied, "Aren't there 12 hours of daylight? Anyone who walks in daylight doesn't stumble because there's plenty of light from the sun. Walking at night, he might very well stumble because he can't see where he's going." And he said these things, which obviously confused the disciples, and then announced, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going to go wake him up." And the disciples said, "Well, Master, if he's gone to sleep, he'll get a good rest and wake up feeling fine. We don't need to go to Judea because Judea is dangerous for Jesus." But Jesus was talking about death while his disciples thought he was talking about taking a nap. Then Jesus became explicit. Lazarus died. And I'm glad for your sakes that I wasn't there. You're about to be given new grounds for believing. Now, let's go to him. And that's when Thomas, the one called the twin and later called the doubter, said to his companions, "Well, come on then, we may as well go die with him." I love Thomas. He's like the Eeyore of the disciples. I guess if this is where Jesus is going and he's going to go to Judea where everybody's on the lookout for him and he's in danger, we may as well go die with him. I mean, that's why we're here, I guess. And when Jesus finally got there, he found Lazarus already 4 days dead. Bethany was near Jerusalem, only a few miles away, and many of the Jews, people who knew Jesus, were visiting Martha and Mary and sympathizing with them over their brother. Martha heard Jesus was coming and went out to meet him. Mary stayed in the house. Interesting. It's the opposite of the usual Mary and Martha story. And Martha said, "Well, Master, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you." So Martha's angry. Who wouldn't be? And if you can't be angry with your closest friends, who can you be angry at? And she says, "If only." This is what happens when we sustain a loss. When we sustain any kind of a loss of our good health, a loss of someone we love, a loss of a job, a loss of a marriage, a loss of some of our illusions. When we sustain a loss, we get angry and then we say, "If only." But Jesus knows you can't change the past. There's really no point in saying if only, except in Martha's case, the point is, I'm really angry with you and I want you to know it. But she can't change it. In verse 33, we'll get there in a minute, when Jesus saw her sobbing and the Judeans with her sobbing, a deep anger welled up with him. And he said to them, "Where'd you put him?" And Jesus gets angry again in verses 38 through 39. And, we don't like angry Jesus much, but that's what's here. He's angry at the death that has taken Lazarus. He's angry at sickness and death. He's angry at all evil. And there's going to be a stink when they roll away the stone from Lazarus because he's actually really and truly dead. But it is nothing to the stink of evil, to those things that cut off our life in their prime, the cheating of life, the wrongs done to those who can't defend themselves. In the face of loss and sorrow, we are not just angry at the present situation, we are angry at all injustice and unfairness and hurt we've sustained and that others live with. We'll talk about that in a minute. When we experience deep loss, anger is a natural reaction, and it builds from all the losses we and others we know about have sustained. And it's important we don't gloss over this. We spend too much of our energy trying to help people get over it or get past it or feel better. I'm not sure you're supposed to feel better when you've sustained a deep loss. Not right away, anyway. The goal is not necessarily to feel better, and that's what we're going to talk about. And we notice Jesus doesn't do this. He doesn't say, "Yeah, really sorry. Gosh, you're right." Or "I had something more important to do." He doesn't even say, "Don't worry, it's going to be okay," yet. Because when we miss the anger, when we miss the passion, when we miss the purpose, we miss the revelation. There is anger and passion and purpose in our grief, and that is what reveals the grace. The grace does not come from feeling better. Feeling better comes as the grace grows through our experience. And that's what we're about to learn. We're about to learn that grace comes to us in some very specific and special ways when we are grieving. And Jesus does not want to deprive his friends of this spiritual growth that is awaiting for them. And he is there. He doesn't stay away because, somehow that's going to help them heal faster or because they need to be left to wallow in it. It's also important that they know they are not alone. You are not alone. Martha said, "If you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And Jesus says, "Well, your brother will be raised up," which I suspect is not very comforting to Martha. Here's why. She is a good Jew, and she says, "I know he'll be raised up in the resurrection at the end of time." And she doesn't say it, but I hear her saying, "Fat lot of good that does me now." And then Jesus says, "You don't have to wait till the end." Now, I find this very confusing until someone explained it to me years ago, and they said, do any of you believe that God is here in the church more than in your home? No. Is God located someplace? Is there anywhere God is not? We understand God to be completely beyond specific space. What's a little more difficult to understand is that God also exists outside of time. Outside of time. Your loved ones who have died, they're not waiting for you. You may be waiting for them, but they're not waiting for you because they exist outside of space and outside of time. They aren't missing you. because they have you in a way that is beyond my capacity to understand, and it's one of those things I just have to say over here, well, it's a mystery, because almost everything spiritual is. Jesus says, you don't have to wait for the end. I am right now, resurrection and life. Believe in me, and even though you die, you live. And here's where we begin to see grace showing up. At this point, Martha's kind of in danger of whiplash because she is going from the past, you should have been here, to the future, I know he'll be raised up in the end. And Jesus is trying to train her eyes on the here and now. Be present now. Well, that's lovely if all you're trying to do is meditate on a yoga mat. And I meditate on a yoga mat. That is not sarcasm at all. But that is entirely a different matter when you are experiencing deep loss from whatever source. Loss of your good health, loss of a friend, loss of an animal that you've loved, loss of your employability, divorce. It's different for all of us. This is hard to turn and face the Jesus who's in the moment with us, because that's where the pain lives too. You'll hear people say, well, you'll get over it. And I could just slap those people. And then some of them also say, you'll never get over it. And I want to slap them too. I don't actually slap anybody. Not really. Yet. In the early days of raw grief, those are the kinds of things that feel like a death sentence. They feel like a death sentence. They can be aching, especially in the dull moments when we are first learning to cope with whatever our loss was. But Jesus is not making Martha a promise about someday. She lives in today, and what happens someday is cold comfort for her. What Jesus is telling her is, grace is going to show up and change you through this. If you don't hear anything else today, know this about loss. Grace is going to change you through that. And that is what grace is for. Grief, sorrow, brokenness, despair, these things happen. They appear in our lives, and we heal. We heal in community. Mark was 42, big strapping guy, and he was sitting in the chair opposite me from my desk, and some of you have heard me tell this story. Bawling his eyes out. His cat had died. And he understood how ridiculous he looked and felt. Well, I didn't think he was ridiculous, but he felt ridiculous. His cat had died 2 weeks previous, and he's bawling his eyes out. And as we talked, I reminded him that his mother had died just the year before. And back in the days when homosexuality was still something that was hidden, he had lived with his partner for 12 years, and when his partner had died of AIDS, the partner's parents came, took everything, took the body, and did not allow Mark an opportunity to be a part of the family memorial. And 4 years before that, his dad had died after a long and lingering illness, and he was an only child. It wasn't about the cat. I think what happens is we have events that are difficult for us, grief of all kinds of things, but particularly the death of people we love. And when someone dies, or we have that kind of grief, we have to open what I call our grief closet. And you open it up, and everything that's ever happened that grieved you falls out on your head. And your job is to graciously, gracefully, slowly pick up each of those things, look at them again, and reorganize the closet. And few people can get their closet reorganized in less than about a year. That is the process where we heal, and it actually happens in community. It happens amongst our family, with our friends, in grief groups, in a movie theater where no one can see you cry, when your friends decide to take you to Disneyland and you laugh and cry the whole time. Even when we're alone in our grief, we're not alone in our grief. Mark went to a grief group that was led by a man in our church who had experienced deep loss, traumatic loss, in fact. And Mark found healing in this group of 12 friends, and he wanted to give back some of what he received. So he led grief groups in our church for over 10 years. With his own tears, Mark began to heal, and he created a space where other people didn't live in the if only, and they didn't live in the someday. They healed because they had people who would sit with them and not say, "It will get better." Why are you crying? Jesus asks. Why are you crying? Are you crying for yourself? I ask you that today. Are you crying for a family member? Do you cry for our community or for our nation or for the world or for the little ones or the raped or the beaten or the cheated? We have different kinds of loss, and grace shows up differently in each of them. There's a poignant loss. My 91-year-old aunt died a few weeks ago, and we had a family gathering. It was the same weekend. We had two funerals that week here at the church. And it was really poignant, but not sad. She had lived a wonderful, happy life. We all remembered her with great love. We cracked jokes about her character defects and her failings. And she died at 91, very alert, and had endured maybe 2 or 3 months of bedridden frailty. There's a sad loss when your heart is heavy, maybe even broken, as when a spouse of many years slips away, or you say goodbye to a beloved animal. There's a hole in your life that nothing else can fill. That's sadness. And that's also a kind of grief. And then there are some losses that are tragic. A woman is raped, she loses her innocence. A child drowns. These are tragedies, and they affect people all around them, and they can make it so much more difficult to heal. They make us question God. They make us question ourselves. And there is traumatic loss. And any of these losses, poignant loss, sad loss, tragic loss, any of those can be traumatic. My mother died suddenly of a heart attack at 59. And the reason, and it was tragic for us and was sad for a long time. It was traumatic, though, because in our family dynamics, it blew a bomb. I mean, it was a bomb that blew a hole in our family. And we were quite an unsettled family until we rearranged ourselves. It took about 3, 4, 5 years to rearrange ourselves. And lots of people live in families where somebody is the glue. That's not always the case. Other times, things are traumatic because they're sudden, or things are traumatic because they have wide consequences. And in each of these, poignant loss, sad loss, tragic loss, traumatic loss, grace shows up. Different ways, for different people, in different situations. And we are never the same again. And that's why Jesus wants Martha to stay right there in the pain. Because if she tries to escape into the if only, or if she tries to hurry up into the I know that someday, she's going to miss where the grace shows up to heal her and to grow her spirit ever larger. This is what Jesus is telling Mary and Martha and all the onlookers in this story. It is a worse death to never have loved. It is a worse death to live oppressed and suffering, which Lazarus was doing. That's how that was. It's a worse death to live without being able to be your true self because those around you can't accept you. It is a worse death to suffer in addiction or depression or poverty. There are more kinds of death than what put you 6 feet under. So I think we know, even if we can't articulate it, we know in our hearts, in our intuition, in our guts, what Jesus is offering us in this story. Love who you love. Try to stay focused on that. Try not to get sidetracked by people's character defects. Love who you love as fully as you can right now. Know that the death of this life is not the only kind of death or even the ultimate death. Jesus is telling everyone there, saying, physical death is not the worst thing that happens to us. There's more for us to enjoy. And we let grief change us. Jesus invites us to let the grief change us for the better and be together. You're not alone. Be together. The inimitable Stephen Sondheim wrote a beautiful song called You Are Not Alone, and our choir is going to sing it. And on June 2nd, just another month, our choir is going to offer you a fabulous concert of Broadway favorites, the moving, the celebratory, all of it. Plan on your calendar to be here the afternoon of June 2nd and support our interns. But I wanted to share with you some of the words of the song they're going to sing now. At choir practice on Thursday, it just spoke to me so very loudly of what Jesus is trying to say about our lives. You're on your own. You're a grown-up. Life is real. Still, you're not alone. Look around you. You have a community. Sometimes people leave you, sometimes they deceive you. Life is hard. There will be grace anyway. People make mistakes. There will be grace anyway. Grace comes from unexpected places. Pay attention. Pay attention. Even when it's hard to see the light, no one is alone. You are not alone. And that is grace enough for us today. Thanks be to God.